I grew up in a small rural town, the kind where everyone knows each other, and secrets don't stay buried for long. At least, not human ones. Our house sat on the edge of a massive cornfield that stretched for miles beyond the horizon. The cornfield was part of my childhood, a place of games and adventures. But as I grew older, I began to notice something that made me uneasy, something that made me avoid the field as much as possible. It wasn't the rustling leaves or the crows that circled the sky like black omens. It was the feeling that I was being watched. It started when I was around 12. I would be out playing near the field's edge, and every so often I'd get that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was standing just out of sight, observing my every move. I'd turn around quickly, expecting to see one of the neighborhood kids, but there was never anyone there, just rows and rows of corn standing eerily still in the wind. Over the years, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, something kids tell themselves to explain their fear of the dark. But things got worse after my 16th birthday. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every time I glanced out the window toward the cornfield at night, I'd catch a glimpse of something, just for a second, standing between the rows. A figure, tall and dark, watching. I told my parents about it once, but they brushed it off. My dad laughed, saying it was probably a scarecrow, and my mum said it was just a trick of the light. But I knew better. We didn't have a scarecrow. We never had. One evening, while my parents were out of town and I was home alone, the unease became unbearable. The wind was howling outside, and the corn was swaying in the breeze, casting strange shadows on the walls of the house. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on the TV, when I heard it. The unmistakable creak of the front porch steps. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I turned off the TV, plunging the room into darkness, and listened. There it was again. Another creak, closer this time, as if someone, or something, was moving up the steps, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and moved toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the cornfield, just beyond the porch light, was the figure. It was taller than I remembered, much taller, almost impossibly so, and its face, if it even had one, was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Its body was cloaked in a long, tattered coat that seemed to sway with the wind, even though it stood perfectly still. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then the figure took a step forward, moving out of the shadows and into the light. That's when I saw its eyes, hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare right through me, devoid of any humanity. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the window shut and locked it, then ran to the door, locking that too. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps on the porch grew louder, heavier, and I could hear the boards creaking under the weight of the figure. It was right outside the door now. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but the doorknob began to rattle, slowly at first, then violently, as if the thing was trying to force its way inside. I backed away, grabbing the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and held it out in front of me, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, clutching the knife, waiting, expecting the door to burst open at any second. But nothing happened. I crept back to the window and cautiously pulled the curtain aside. The figure was gone. The porch was empty, and the cornfield, once again, stood silent. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, listening for any sound, any sign that it might come back. But the house remained still, and by morning, I convinced myself it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. For weeks, I refused to go near the cornfield. I stayed inside, kept the curtains drawn, and made excuses to avoid being alone at night. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every night, I could feel its eyes on me, waiting. And then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again, the creak of the porch steps. This time, I didn't bother to look. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. I'd heard the stories, sure. Who hasn't? But they were always just that. Stories. Things people made up to scare themselves, to explain the unexplainable. That was until I moved into that old house and encountered something I couldn't explain. It was an old Victorian with creaky floors and tall, narrow windows that let in the faintest light. The house had been on the market for years, and when I saw it listed for such a low price, I jumped at the opportunity. It was a fixer-upper, but I loved its character and charm. It felt like a place I could turn into a home. But almost from the moment I moved in, I began to feel uneasy. The house was too quiet, even during the day. There was this heaviness in the air, like something was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my nerves from the stress of the move. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The first real sign that something wasn't right came about a week after I'd moved in. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I heard it, a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped upstairs. I froze, listening, but there was nothing else, just silence. I chalked it up to the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound again. This time, it was clearer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above me. My heart raced as I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, right above my room, and then nothing. The house fell silent again. The next morning, I went upstairs to investigate. I checked every room, opened every closet, but there was nothing out of place. No sign that anyone had been there. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Over the next few days, the sounds became more frequent. Footsteps on the stairs, doors creaking open, and once, in the dead of night, I heard what sounded like faint whispering, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. But every time I got up to check, there was nothing. It wasn't until I started noticing the shadow that I began to truly fear for my sanity. I'd be sitting in the living room, watching TV or reading, when I'd catch something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape, just at the edge of my vision, moving up the stairs. Every time I looked directly at it, it would vanish. But I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. One night, I decided to stay up late, determined to catch whatever was making the noise. I sat in the living room, lights off, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I was starting to think I'd scared it off when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the stairs. I didn't move. I barely breathed as the footsteps drew closer, each one sending a wave of dread through me. And then I saw it. At the top of the stairs, illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body draped in shadow, its face hidden in darkness. I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew it was staring at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, as the figure descended the stairs, one slow step at a time. When it reached the bottom, it stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, it stood there, watching me. And then it disappeared, just vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my bags the next morning and left the house, unable to shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever understand. I don't know what that thing was, or why it chose to haunt me, but even now, months later, I can't walk past a staircase without feeling that same sense of dread, that same certainty that something is watching from the shadows. And I'll never live in an old house again.